Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be talking about the Queen's Gambit, beginning with d4, d5, c4. We're going to be talking about the Slav defense, and then after knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, we're going to be playing the Semi-Slav, and after bishop to g5, we're going to be talking about the mainline Semi-Slav, the mainline Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav, beginning with the move d captures c4. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So this, for years, was one of my main weapons against the Queen's Gambit, was to play the Slav and to go into the Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav. There's, of course, an alternative here. You can play the Moscow variation, beginning with h6. But what I didn't like about this is there was this one Topolov versus Kramnik game that was going around that looked very frightening. Basically, white can continue bishop h4, and then after d takes c4, e4, g5, bishop g3, b5. This does look very similar to the Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav, but the e5 square is available for the white knight, and I do not like this because what Topolov did against Kramnik was after bishop to e2, bishop b7, castles, knight on b7, knight e5, bishop g7, Topolov uncorked this very frightening sacrifice beginning with knight f7. The point being that after king f7, pawn to e5, when this knight moves, we're going to have the bishop flying into the light squares. We also have potential on the f-file. We have potential with the queen. We have potential with this knight coming in to e4 and d6, and the position is just extremely, extremely frightening. As a matter of fact, what happened in the game was knight d5, knight e4, king e7, knight d6, queen b6, bishop to g4, rook af8, queen c2, and at least according to the engine, even though black is up a piece here, white is the one with an advantage. White has a slight edge, according to the engine. So, naturally, I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to be in this game. I didn't want to have to play this position with black. And as a matter of fact, Topolov went on to win this game against Kramnik and Wittgenstein back in 2008. So I didn't like the Moscow variation, really, just for this reason. So I would play the Botvinnik variation. Another thing that motivated me to play the Botvinnik variation is I learned a lot by reading the book Fire on Board by Alexei Shirov. And I liked a lot of his analysis in that book, and I followed a lot of his preparation that he suggested in that book, Fire on Board. So that's what motivated me to play this Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav. So we have d takes c4, and then we have e4, and now we have b5. And what makes this position quite a bit different than the Moscow variation is that in order to get black to play h6 and g5, you really need to play the move e5. The point is if you just try to transpose or play something passive, there really is no obligation to ever play h6 and g5. So like, for example, bishop e2, h6, bishop h4. Of course, we could transpose with g5, but why would we do that? Why would we weaken our king side without being prompted? We can just play bishop to e7 here, and then after, say, castles, castles, according to the engine, this position is just slight edge black. Our king is perfectly safe. We have no weaknesses. We have an extra pawn on the c4 square. So this position is slight edge black. So other lines have similar issues. You know, a4 can be met with queen b6, and black is doing okay. So really, white needs to play the move pawn to e5 to get anything out of this position, and this, of course, prompts black to play h6 and g5. So h6, bishop h4, g5, and now we reach the position where we sort of have the main line of the Botvinnik Semi-Slav. Now, if they retreat here, if they play bishop to g3, I think knight d5, we can just sort of declare this slight edge black. And as a matter of fact, this is what happened in Piquet versus Anand that was played back in Monaco Rapid back in 1994. And Anand ended up actually winning that game. The game continued bishop e2, queen a5, rook to c1, bishop to b7, castles, knight takes c3, and at least according to the engine, after knight to c3, black has a slight edge. So black really has no problems here. So again, we come back to, if we want to get anything out of this position, we have to play one of two lines with white. There are two lines here worth playing. There's the old tried and tested main line, knight takes g5, which is probably best. And then there's this alternative, e takes f6. Now, against e takes f6, we have to take on h4. Knight e5 is the normal move here. And then queen captures f6. Now, I had this happen in my own experience, and I responded poorly to white's next move. The two sort of main moves here are a4 and g3, and black is actually okay against both of these. I had somebody play bishop e2 against me, and I did not respond with the correct move, and I ended up with a disadvantage with black, and I ended up not getting my bishop out, which was bad. The correct move here is just knight d7. Basically, you don't care if they take on c6. That's the whole point. You need to contest that knight right away. After knight takes c6, you're going to play bishop b7, and after bishop f3, you just play a6 and hold your pawn, and you've got your bishop to the long diagonal, you've got your bishop out, and you actually have a good game. And at least according to the engine, this is already major advantage black, and this was actually played in Kravtsov versus Ivanov, played in St. Petersburg back in 1999. So this is definitely the way to go. And I didn't know that. But you need to be prepared for other moves as well. Against g3, you should, again, play knight d7 and contest that knight right away. Queen e2, c5 is good for black. And then another line that you need to be prepared for is after queen f6, they could play a4, and then you should just play a6, ab5, cb5, knight b5. And this does look a little wild, but apparently the correct move, which was actually played in Martic versus Sergov, was a takes b5. You sacrifice the rook on a8, you throw in this check first, and then after king e2, bishop d6 holds the knight on b8 and is decisive advantage black. White cannot get out his bishop and rook, and his king is severely unsafe. And therefore black has more than enough compensation for the exchange and should actually have a decisive advantage. So this is decisive advantage black. So that pretty much covers this sideline with e takes f6. Black is apparently doing pretty good here. Anywhere from, total equality, slight edge, decisive advantage, somewhere in there. Really nothing to be worried about. So knight takes g5 is objectively the best move, and we're going into the main line. So knight takes g5, h takes g5, bishop g5. So now knight b7 is the correct move, and now there's a couple of different lines here that white can play. White can play the immediate e takes f6, and white can play g3. So against g3, I actually recommend the old Shirov line with rook g8. Interesting, funny side note. The old main line here, bishop to b7, there was actually a mistake that was sort of built into the theory of this line, which was kind of funny. After bishop to b7, people would play e takes f6, and then you would have c5, d5, and this is all well and good. And people were playing knight takes f6 with black, which is still all well and good. And then after bishop to g2, people were playing bishop to e7, castles, and then you had knight takes d5, bishop takes e7, king takes e7, to connect the queen to the rook. But the main reason they were doing this is because there was a drawing line that was happening after knight to b5, queen b6, knight a3. People were getting draws with this move, rook to h4. And it is actually a really good move. There's nothing wrong with rook h4. As a matter of fact, the engine today gives this as a draw. And I actually knew a player, a grandmaster by the name of Gregory Serper, who had this position right when this line was going around. And he had the option to play rook h4, but instead he played c3. And then Serper ended up getting a good game with black, and he actually ended up getting a draw. And then after the game, his opponent showed him what he intended to play if Serper had played this other line with rook to h4, because what was going on in the main line is people were playing queen d2, because queen d2 was the main line, and then people were playing this move rook to g8, thinking that it led to a forced draw. Now, of course, the correct move is actually knight f4. After just knight f4, black apparently does get the draw. After knight f4, knight takes c4, queen a6, bishop takes b7, knight h3 check, king g2, queen b7 check, f3, rook d8, queen c3, rook takes c4 takes, queen b2, and then these checks does actually end in a forced perpetual. This was played in Potkin versus Yokovich, played back in 2008. But if you play instead of knight to f4, this move rook g8, which everybody thought gave a draw at the time, white can play pawn to f4. And what everybody was doing back then was they were making this terrible mistake. They were playing knight takes f4, rook f4, rook f4, queen f4, and then they were taking on b2. And pause the video, see if you can find the win here for white. Well, if you said queen c7 with perpetual check, you were absolutely wrong. But that actually happened in a game, and that's what people were following. They thought it was just perpetual. It's not. The correct move is queen d6 check, sacrificing the queen, and then after king d6, knight takes c4 is completely winning. And in the games that I have on the database, some people just resigned on the spot after queen to d6. So It is a nasty move. White is just winning on the spot. King d6, knight takes c4. So people were missing that. But again, this was back in the late 90s that this was happening. The late 90s and early 2000s. So computers just were not that good, and people were missing stuff like this within their preparation, all the time. So this type of thing was still happening. So that was, the old main line. But I actually, like I said, I'm a fan of Shirov, and I like the line that Shirov gives here with rook to g8. And as a matter of fact, Shirov has a really good game that he played against Kramnik. Continued rook g8, h4, rook takes g5, h takes g5, and then knight to d5. Now, what I really like about this line is if White doesn't play very energetically here, already Black can declare that he has a major advantage. I had a game very recently happen where my opponent played pawn to f4 against me, and I just continued immediately with queen a5, and this position is already major advantage Black according to the engine. Now, one of the things about these positions in the Botvinnik Semi-Slav in general is that computers will often misassess these positions because they underestimate these pawns on b5 and c4. So a lot of times you'll see computers overestimate White's position because they look at these static pawns in the middle and they superficially think, well, White has more space. But they don't attribute the same space advantage to Black over here on the queen side until the pawns become mobile, or until they see a way for the pawns to eventually become mobile. And then suddenly you'll see the assessments that the computer gives will flip-flop. So if I absolutely had to play an engine in a match and I had to try to beat it, the Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav might be something that I would try, just because of how the computers do occasionally misassess these positions. So after I played queen a5, this position is major advantage Black. So they have to play energetically like Kramnik played. They have to play g6, which happened in Shirov versus Kramnik, Kramnik versus Shirov, played in Monaco back in 2002. That game continued fg6, queen g4, queen e7, bishop to g2, king d8, queen takes g6, queen b2, queen c2, and here Shirov made a mistake. But again, this was played back in 2002. We didn't know any better, and a lot of people copied him because it was Shirov, and he was kind of one of the leading experts in this opening. And he won against Kramnik, who was kind of like the best player in the world at the time. So he played queen a5 here. And after queen a5, Kramnik made the mistake of castling kingside, which was apparently bad. And after that, Shirov played knight to b6 and was already equal. And then after knight e4, Shirov played king c7, and this was already major advantage Black, and Shirov did go on to win. Now, the correct move back here is to play something like king f1, and that's what a lot of people found later. A whole bunch of players found king f1 later, and king f1 is apparently major advantage White. The absolutely correct move here, the computer move that nobody played, ever, was the move bishop takes d5, which is the computer line, and which is the modern computer line. Bishop takes d5, cd5, queen g6 is decisive advantage White according to the engine. So that was the absolute correct way to play. A sample line would be like bishop b4, queen e6, bishop c3 check, and then king f1, just ignoring everything because the Black king is weak. Bishop d4, check, 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 and basically Black can just resign. So that's what the modern engine spits out. It thinks that Black is just losing there after bishop takes c5, cd5, queen g6 with a huge attack. So I said originally I recommended this line, and I still do. But queen a5 is obviously a mistake. So what should we play instead? Well, what we should play instead is knight c3. And what's interesting, and maybe the reason that people don't go into this line today, is because the computer still says this position is major advantage White. But remember what I said. Computers often misassess these lines until they see that the pawns are mobile on the queen side, because that's where Black is generating his counterplay, is with these mobile queenside pawns. So after knight to c3, bc3, queen a3, I just kept looking at the computer analysis and just went straight down the top line that the computer gives, which is bishop to c6, rook to b8, king f1, rook b6, bishop back to e4, and now b4. And now at this point, the computer thinks the position is equal, or close to equal. And it's because now the pawns on the queen side have suddenly become mobile, and now the computer can properly assess the position by comparing these pawns over here that are now mobile versus these static pawns that are simply gaining space. And now it can assess the position appropriately, and now the computer actually thinks black is doing okay. And the final computer line that was given here was c takes b4, rook takes b4, and then king g2, rook b2. And now already white could potentially make a mistake if, for example, queen c4, queen e3 is advantage black. So white has to find the move queen to c1, and then we have queen to b4 holding that pawn. Queen e3, bishop b7, bishop f3, pawn to c3, making that pawn more dangerous. Rook ac1, exchanging light-squared bishops, simply taking on d4. And at this point, the computer was frightened enough by the passed c-pawn, and frightened enough by the weaknesses that it has on f2 and the weaknesses that it has on the light squares, and it just wanted to get out of this mess. So it starts trying to force a perpetual. The computer played rook h8, king e8, and then forced a perpetual with queen a8 check, knight b8, queen f3, knight back to d7, queen e8 with equality. So that's sort of the reason why I still like this move back here, this rook sacrifice with rook g5, and why I feel like this line is still to be recommended. So that leaves the other continuation that you have to be prepared for. That leaves e captures f6. Well, the main line is perfectly fine, and I still like to follow the way that Shirov played it. Bishop to b7 is fine, g3, c5, d5. And now, Shirov played sort of a sideline here. He played this move, bishop to h6. And it's kind of an interesting sideline. And again, it's a position that often the computer will misassess, because again, it doesn't recognize how powerful those queenside pawns are. But we have this game, Kamsky versus Shirov, played back in 1993, that continued bishop to h6, rook h6, queen d2, queen takes f6. And that Kamsky versus Shirov game continued with the move castles queenside, king to f8, f4, knight to b6, bishop g2, e takes d5. And of course, Shirov's got a super interesting game here. The assessment is very unclear, but Shirov did actually go on to win. You can see that it's very scary having your king over here facing all these pawns that are rolling down the board. So the other way that this can sort of go is if instead of castles queenside, they were to just continue with something like knight to e4, you would have something like queen f3 here. And this actually leads to a very forced continuation. This is probably white's best way to go, but of course it requires a lot of theoretical knowledge. This was played in Zontek versus Popov, played back in Poland in 2001, and the game continued knight d6, king e7, knight takes b7, and then this excellent move, rook h5, and now apparently rook g1 is not 100% the best, and that allowed rook takes d5, and after rook takes d5, black is doing okay, and eventually black went on to win. Sort of the idea here is bishop g2, rook takes d2, bishop takes f3, rook takes b2, and of course now we can see that these queenside pawns are very, very scary. So anyway, so that's your introduction to the theory of the Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav. Wild positions, wild complications, a lot of room to get an advantage, a lot of room to go into scary complications and get a great position. And overall, the positions are still very rich and very interesting, and there's a lot of undiscovered territory that you can go into. So I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you found it useful. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.